Hi everyone, this is the third lecture of week 4. And again, you can listen to this as an audio, and it would be best if you have read Genesis 19 before you watch the video. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the kind of infamous story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as look at what happens to Abraham's nephew Lot. Okay. Now, Lot, I haven't said a lot about Lot thus far, so I'm going to give a short summary of what's been going on with him, okay? We are told in Genesis 12:4 that Lot, Abraham's nephew, moves with his uncle and his family from Ur, okay? And of course, this was a pretty risky move for him and his family as well. But the reason why Lot probably goes along with Abraham, okay, is because Abraham and Sarah, as we know, are childless at that point, and therefore it is likely the case that that Lot is Abraham's heir. Okay, indeed, it's not not uncommon for nephews to be heirs to their uncle, okay, or of their uncle, for example, Augustus Caesar. Okay. As the patriarchal narratives are centered on who will be Abraham's heir, and therefore not just the inheritor of Abraham's wealth, but also the Abrahamic promise, Lot is in the beginning presented as a possible contender to that. Okay, so it may be Lot. Okay? And what the subsequent chapters in Genesis tries to show is to slowly reveal to the reader why and in what ways Lot will not be the inheritor of the Abrahamic promise. You know, why he is not the elect. Okay? This attempt to deselect or disqualify Lot as a possible Abrahamic heir begins almost immediately. So in Genesis 13, the very next chapter after we're told about Abraham and Lot's move, we are told that after a dispute about water among the herdsmen, that Lot and Abraham decide to go their separate ways. And Lot, we are told, goes towards Sodom and Gomorrah because of how lush it was. Okay? Of course, considering that the reader knows what will happen eventually to Sodom and Gomorrah, this again might be a kind of ding on Lot. Okay? Already, Lot has shown that he does not make good choices, and therefore might not be prudent enough to become the heir to the Abrahamic promise. Okay? Now, the biblical writers at points are not super subtle, okay? And they add in another story, just for good measure, showing the ineptitude of Lot, okay? When, in Genesis 14, so the very next chapter, it describes how Lot is kidnapped by warring tribes, okay? He is saved only when Abraham gets involved. Abraham comes in with his men, okay, battles these tribes, and saves Lot and his family. Okay, so again, Lot is either pictured as very unlucky or kind of inept, or maybe both. Okay, neither qualities that befit the heir of Abraham. Okay, and as I will discuss in the next video, the negative portrayal of Lot has a political function, which is that it's used to demean and make fun of the descendants of Lot, who incidentally are portrayed as neighbors of the Israelites, okay, neighbors of Israel in the Transjordan area. Okay. The final coffin, okay, the final nail in the coffin to the possibility of Lot as Abraham's heir, however, is found in what happens in Genesis 19 with Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, when we last left off at Genesis 18, while God is chatting with Abraham about whether bargaining, as Abraham is bargaining God down. Okay, we are told that two angels who came with God for the meal head towards Sodom and Gomorrah to check out how things are on the ground, literally. Okay? And when the angels arrive, we are told that no one takes them in, okay, except for Lot. And notice that the lack of hospitality that the angels find in Sodom and Gomorrah, okay, is contrasted to the hospitality shown by Abraham in the immediately preceding chapter, and also to some degree by Lot, who is related to Abraham. Okay. Now, when the guests are about to go to sleep, things go awry, and this is Genesis 19, verse 4. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, Where are the men who came with you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. Lot went out to the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men with blindness who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Okay. So lots of disturbing and odd things in this passage. Okay. Notice the first odd thing is that the town seems to be full of like only men. Okay, which I can tell you probably spells trouble for this town. Okay. Notice also, like I said before, the lack of hospitality. Okay, and of course in the Middle East, there is a great emphasis on hospitality, on how you treat guests. Okay, you know, and of course, like I said, we've seen that in the immediately preceding chapter, Genesis 18, where Abraham really demonstrates how you're supposed to correctly behave with a guest. Okay, and of course, what the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah do is the very opposite. Not only do they not, you know, welcome and feed and protect their guests, but they want to do the opposite, violate them. Okay, which leads to kind of next point. Okay, and obviously, the demand that the guests be brought out so that the men can know them means, you know, this is euphemism for sexually violate them, as we saw with the story in the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge, you know, knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge is a euphemism to describe sex. Okay? I'm going to talk about whether this is about homosexuality in a moment, but, you know, needless to say, it is very clearly, you know, about power. Okay? The reason in part why you treat guests with hospitality is because they are vulnerable. And in a culture where hospitality is expected, like the Near East, and continuing on in the modern Middle East as well, okay? You know, hospitality is really about how you treat those who are vulnerable, who have less power than you, okay, who are unprotected, okay? And the story in part seems to be, therefore, about the correct use, the correct ethical use of power, which intersects to some degree with issues of hospitality. Okay, and speaking of power, notice that, and this is the next point, notice that the story revolves around male power. Okay, all the townfolk who show up to sexually abuse the visitors, and these visitors are both male, and that's important. That is, you know, all the townfolk who show up to overpower these other men are men. Okay, hence violating the power of other men. Okay, that is what seems to be desired by the townsfolk. Okay, and it seems to be desired precisely because this was seen, violating the power of other men. Okay, because this act was seen as the ultimate wrong in this patriarchal context. Okay, the crime, in short, centers on the fact that it is the deprivation or taking away of male power by other men. Okay, when it is women at play, okay, women who are victims, things are different. And that comes out through the narrative as well. Overpowering women and sexually abusing women is interestingly not depicted as equally egregious, maybe less of a crime. Indeed, even possibly okay if you are granted the right to do so by the men who own or have power over these women, namely their fathers, husbands, or brothers. Okay, and we see this when, of course, Lot disturbingly, I guess, volunteers to throw out his virgin daughters to the town's, you know, the men of the town to rape instead, and in place of the male visitors. Okay, this is, of course, not a very nice picture of Lot. Lot will suffer for it, as you'll see in the next video. Okay. You know, we'll discuss what happens to the family after, okay, they are struck with blindness. Okay. Now, and so what is the purpose of the story? And this is a story about, you know, homosexuality, as it has been interpreted. Okay, and so firstly, the story, may be again another kind of atheological origin tale. Okay, meant to, kind of describe and explain why they are these kind of dry, desolate, almost destroyed-like, dead-like places near the Dead Sea. And why does the land look like this here? Oh, well, it's because it used to be a town, but they were bad, and so it was destroyed by God, and blah 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 blah. Okay. Now, speaking of the reasons, or the story as a kind of etiology of a place that looks destroyed. Okay, we have to turn out to why was this town destroyed, or why was Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by God? Or another way to put it is, what is the crime here? Okay, what do they do wrong? Okay, and of course, when I turn to that question, I have to mention that this story, the reason why it gets so much attention is because previous interpreters have argued that the reason why Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed here is because of their desire for homosexual actions or homosexuality. Okay, and of course, this is where we get the word sodomize. Okay. And therefore, the old reading is that the story is, an injunction against homosexuality. Okay, and this interpretation, this is maybe one of the best interpretations of how a group of interpreters can really let their own desires, assumptions, biases, or whatever, okay, insecurities, probably, okay, issues, okay, overwhelm the biblical text and kind of rewrite it in their minds. Okay, so let's, instead of assuming that, let's try to read the text a bit more neutrally and see what the story might be really about. Okay, so what is the misdeed for which Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed? Okay, is it homosexuality? Okay, so there's a couple of clues. Okay, the first is that, as I noted, the story in Genesis 18 about the visitation of God and the angels seems to set the context, seems to almost be a preview, set the context for the scene about Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And as I stated, one of the key comparisons between the two stories seems to center on the right treatment of guests and the powerless, and issues of hospitality. Okay, so all of that, if you read Genesis 8:19 in the context of Genesis 18, which I think is how it's supposed to be read in its own context, okay, then it seems to imply that the reason why Sodom and Gomorrah might be destroyed is is because of hospitality and issues of power that's involved with that. Okay. Two, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Okay, this story seems to center on the sexual violation of men, which as I stated, is mainly about power and authority in a patriarchal context. Okay, and this is very different from homosexuality. Homosexuality is not the same thing as sexually violating or raping someone. Okay, and it is this latter thing, okay, the overpowering and sexually violating, okay, men who are also guests. That's the main issue here. Not whether the townsfolk prefer to have sexual relations with men or women. Okay. Notice again that sexually overpowering women is not as big of a problem if the violators are given permission by the women's male owners. I'm not saying this is better. I'm just saying it's that's what's presented here. Okay. The fact that Lot is willing to throw out his daughters and that he has every right to do so is probably precisely why the men of the town do not take Lot up on this offer. With Lot's permission, the violation of his daughters is no longer a crime. It's not a misdeed. Okay. In other words, the problem is not that the men of the town prefer men sexually. We don't actually find out, which gender they prefer. Okay. We don't find out about their sexual preferences per se. Okay. We only find out that they want to commit a violation against someone that they are not allowed to violate. Okay. Which in this case are men, other men, and guests. Okay. The story, in short, seems to be about violation, who is permitted to violate whom and who is not. Okay, like I said, the violation of women with the permission of their fathers or brothers or husbands is not envisioned as an egregious act, and this is why it's probably the townsfolk do not want to do it, not because they have a gender preference of sexual partners. Okay. Indeed, the reason why they want to, the townsfolk that is, want to rape or sexually abuse the male guest is because they are, they want to be really, really bad, okay? And raping two male guests who are under the protection of a patriarch, another male head of the household, this is the kind of worst thing you can do in this context, okay? So again, there seems to be some hints. This is not necessarily about homosexuality, okay, but about, again, power and male power in particular, okay. There's a third clue as to the crime at Sodom and Gomorrah, for which they were destroyed, again, which seems to point, against this idea that it's about homosexuality, okay. Notice that in Genesis 18, when God is talking with Abraham, he tells Abraham the reason why he's thinking about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, and this is found in chapter 18, Genesis 18, verse 20. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how grave is their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Notice the outcry, the repetition, right? This is again repeated in Genesis 19, verse 13. The angels again mention this outcry. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against this people had become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Notice the repetition of outcry, okay, as the reason given for why Sodom and Gomorrah are about to be destroyed, okay. And the word for outcry in Hebrew is sa'aka or za'aka. They're actually the same word, slightly different pronunciation, okay. These words are found at particular points in the Hebrew scriptures, okay? One of the main ways is to describe the mistreatment of the Israelites in Egypt in Exodus 3, verse 7, okay? It's also used, the same word is also used to describe the mistreatment of defenseless widows and orphans, the kind of lowest of the low, the most powerless, okay? In Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 through 23, okay, and in Isaiah 5:7, this word outcry, okay, again is used to talk about the lack of justice and righteousness, okay. Considering all of this evidence, the misdeed, there's, big hints here that the misdeed that so outraged God, okay, it has to do something, especially with this, outrage language, this cry language, right, has to do something with the mistreatment of those who are vulnerable, okay, those who are less powerless, okay. And indeed, this is the interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah that is remembered throughout the, biblical text, okay. So we do find the mention of Sodom and Gomorrah in other parts of in the biblical text, okay. So for example, if you turn to Ezekiel, chapter 16, verses 48 and 50, okay, Ezekiel seems to remember Sodom and Gomorrah as being destroyed because they did not help the needy or the poor. So due to social economic inequality, okay, this is what Ezekiel says, okay. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, your sister Sodom and her daughters never did what you and your daughters have done. Okay, now this was a sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them as you have seen. Okay, so notice what the sin of Sodom is. It is not, being arrogant, overfed, unconcerned, not helping the poor and needy, in which case I think we're kind of screwed. Okay. In Jeremiah 23:14, the misdeed is remembered, the misdeed of Sodom and Gomorrah is remembered as something slightly more general. And here you do get some kind of sexual misdeed, kind of. Okay. This is what Jeremiah 23, verse 14 says. But in the prophets, among the prophets of Jerusalem, I have seen a shocking thing. They commit adultery, walk in lies. They strengthen the hand of evildoers so that no one turns from wickedness. All of them have become like Sodom to me, and its inhabitants like Gomorrah. Okay. In Jeremiah, there seems to be some misdeed, lying, adultery is mentioned explicitly. Okay. It's really only very late by the time of Jude in the New Testament text. And of course, you have to remember that the New Testament comes from a very different context, this kind of Greco-Roman context, right? With different sexual hangups, okay? It's only by the time of the New Testament that you get the misdeed as something approaching something sexual, okay? And even here in Jude, it's not clear that homosexuality is really meant, okay? So this is what Jude says. I'm going to say it very quickly. Jude 1, verse 7, likewise Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner as they indulged in sexual immorality and went after other flesh, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Okay, notice how even in Jude, is sexual immorality and whatever going after other fleshes. Okay, in short, this is all a way of saying, looking at the evidence, it is very difficult, at least for me, to think that the misdeed for which Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed is anything like modern homosexuality, what we think of homosexuality now. Okay, one, you have to recognize that our vision of homosexuality is very particular, it's contextual. Okay, and it wouldn't have been seen or thought of in the same way by the ancient biblical authors. Okay. Secondly, and more importantly, the textual proof that I have just presented seems to point to the conclusion that the story, Sodom and Gomorrah story, is not really about homosexuality or people who prefer one gender over another. Okay, rather, as I noted, the target of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah seems to be again elsewhere. Okay, I think that the target is again the Canaanites. Okay, remember that Sodom and Gomorrah are towns located in Canaan. Okay, the Canaanites, who the biblical text again charges with, being baddies, right? In this case, well, they're inhospitable, they mistreat their guests, and they mistreat their vulnerable. They're such scum. Okay, instead of giving their guests, male guests, respect and food and hospitality, they'll try to kind of sexually abuse them. Okay. As I stated earlier, the writers have a reason to target the Canaanites. The Canaanites were the native population, the native group who were dwelling in the land that the Israelites wanted and conquered. Okay, and whom the Israelite writer is therefore, he's constantly warning people to not be like the Canaanites. Okay. And so why does he do this? Why is he so upset against the Canaanites? Well, the reason for the denigration of the Canaanites is, of course, because the Israelites want a justification for why they need to be conquered. Okay. The misinterpretation of Genesis 19 as about homosexuality, therefore, reveals the biases in our own thinking, not necessarily in the thinking of the biblical writers. Okay. Certainly, the biblical writers, as I've just presented to you, were not liberals or progressives either. Okay, they're not really for or against homosexuality because I don't think they care about it. They don't know about why they don't know about it because it doesn't exist in the same way for them. Okay, rather, as I just said, the biblical writers had their own biases, their own axe to grind, and their own groups of different people that they wanted to maybe belittle and justify conquest of. Okay. This is, of course, not surprising, as both the writers of the text as well as the readers of the text are people with their own blind spots, their own prejudices. Okay, and then recognizing the prejudices in the biblical text and also in the past interpretations of these biblical texts, the hope is that we are better able to see and therefore possibly correct, okay, our own prejudices, issues, and biases that we still have and that come to play when we read this text.